I thought, as usual, the easiest thing to do is to get each person to introduce themselves, but I'd like them to introduce themselves by saying what they do now and how they came to be doing what they do now. So, Chris, unfortunately, you're at the end. So you
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm delighted to be part of this. My name is Chris Pentney. I have just begun to run a new folk music agency called Sharper Than. It's a musicians booking and management agency. But the way I came to it was actually I've spent the last 21 years working with Folkworks. First of all, as projects manager and touring manager for Folkworks when it was an independent organisation. It was the Folk and Traditional Music Development Agency for the North East and Cumbria. And then it became one of the founding partners of Sage Gateshead. And so for the last 12 years, I've been part of the team at Sage Gateshead and been responsible for booking virtually all of the folk and traditional music that happened within the building and at various venues outside and a couple of festivals as well.
How did you get involved in Folkworks in the first place?
Well, that's an interesting story. It was a real sort of sideways career move. I had actually previously co-founded a whole food co-op when I was living in Leicester. And I moved back up to the northeast and saw this amazing looking job with Folkworks. I was really, really interested in folk music. It was my passion. I hate to say it, a Morris dancer. And just really passionate about folk music, and the idea of scheduling musicians to various venues around the country didn't seem that different to scheduling delivery rounds of beans and lentils. So it was a way of transferable skills plus passion.
And then one final question, which we'll come back to. What's the biggest change for you? Because you've been, 20 years plus of working in the folk scene.
You mean in the music generally, or
just in terms of how you were doing any dramatic changes in how you did your job, or did it remain just like moving lentils around?
Kind of, but actually I'm now doing the mirror image of the job that I was doing before.
Yeah.
So I am now the person whose emails and telephone calls go unanswered, and I'm the one badgering people for gigs rather than the other way around. But it's I'm really excited about still about the prospect and the way folk music is happening in this country, and that there are still audiences to develop.
I suppose I'm thinking about, do you think the folk music scene is healthier now than it was when you started? Less healthy, the same?
I think it's very healthy, and I think it is through the work of organisations like Folkworks, but also things like the Newcastle University Folk and Traditional Music degree have contributed hugely to the national scene. As well as the regional scene. So I think it's in a healthier state. And the fact that bands like the now demised Bellahead, but the fact that Bellahead had made it over into the mainstream, playing traditional English music. They played Morris dance tunes. Nobody would have seen that coming 20 years ago.
I should also add, it was very, very nice to have the head of Newcastle Music Department speaking in a broad Scottish accent. And that, of course, has also had a significant effect on Scottish musicians. If I could leave you out for a second, Matt, and turn to Paul to answer a similar question.
Right, okay. Again, I'd like to sort of say thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I was a bit disconcerted in the introductory comments to hear references to popular music. I thought, well, I've obviously come to the wrong place. But to explain how I do come to be here, you actually have to go back over 50 years to 1960, when, as a teenager, I had the radio on in the background, not particularly listening to it. It was a sort of general music programme of the sort you tend not to get now. And suddenly, out of the radio came this noise which caused the hairs on my head, and I had some then, to stand up. The artist was Charles Mingus. The tune, I even remember this, was called Gunslinging Bird, and it was a kind of Damascene moment for me, and basically determined my listening habits for all the decades that have passed since. That was a surprise, and that for me is the essence of jazz. I mean, the critic Whitney Bolliat, it's almost become a cliche now, defined jazz as the sound of surprise. But that is what I still, more than 5 decades later, look for in music. I want to be surprised. When I go to a gig, I want something that gets me going, bloody hell, I hadn't expected that, or I've never heard something like that before. And that is why I am so enthusiastic about jazz as a live music, about live performance. Indeed, I would argue that jazz as an improvised music, in theory, never the same twice. The live performance is the essence of the music, and I still much prefer to actually go to live gigs than to listen to recordings, because I still know I'm going to get that thrill that I got. I hope to get that thrill that I got in those early days. I only became involved as a promoter with Jazz North East about a dozen years ago when I took retirement from my job as a librarian. As always happens with things like this, you join an organisation intending just to help a little bit around the edges and get gradually sucked in until it becomes... Well, I mean, my wife says to me, you work much harder than you ever did when you were a librarian, and at least you got paid for doing that. Jazz North East is an entirely voluntary organisation, as indeed are most jazz promoters up and down the UK. It's a small organisation in comparison with many others. We don't have our own dedicated venue. We use a number of different venues around Newcastle and Gateshead. There are pros and cons to that, I think. The cons obviously are it can be a bit confusing for audiences. You know, if you've got a single venue, you can build up a bit of loyalty. The advantage, though, is that we can use different venues depending on the sort of gig that we're putting on, because some work better for, say, improv gigs, more straight-ahead stuff works better elsewhere. We put on around 40 gigs a year. And it's a very diverse programme. I mean, I've put copies of our latest programme around, which will give you some idea. Incidentally, I should point out the guy on the front is not actually me.
Yes, I was going to ask.
That's the German drummer Gunther Baby Sommer, who may be my long-lost brother, although as far as I'm aware, my late father never went to Germany. But incidentally, Baby is playing this Sunday at the Bridge Hotel in the company of one of Simon's colleagues, Raymond MacDonald on saxophone, so it would be great to see you there. We have kind of 4 strands to our programming. There is a straight-ahead strand which operates more in the sort of broad jazz tradition, although we do expect artists to be bringing something new even to that. You know, we're not interested in people just getting up and playing a load of standards. We have a strand which is for bands playing entirely original compositions. I mean, that's a hard rule. I always say to the bands, for each standard you play, we're docking 10% of your fee. That concentrates their minds enormously. We have a strand called Splinter, which are normally double bills with a local band and a touring band. And we have our On the Outside strand, which is dedicated to free improv, free jazz. So it's a very diverse and adventurous programme. I say we're a small organisation, but I think because of the adventurousness of our programme, we have built something of a reputation. I am quite proud of that. We have an international reputation. A couple of examples, just last December, the Joe Morris Quartet, which is a leading free jazz quartet from New York, flew into Newcastle to play their one and only UK gig as part of a European tour in Newcastle. And that was a conscious decision on the part of the musicians because they know of the reputation of Jazz North East. And in January this year, we had an all-day event called Paris-sur-Tyne, bringing in musicians from France. 8 bands over the course of the day of French and Anglo-French jazz. And again, those musicians flew in from Paris just to do that event for us and flew back the next day. So I'd like to think we perhaps sort of fight above our weight a bit, and by and large I'm very proud, and I hope to be able to continue to do this for the future.
Thanks. I'll come back and talk to you about funding later, but just the same questions to Chris. I mean, do you think the jazz scene is as healthy as it was when you started out?
I think the jazz scene in the 50 odd years I've been listening to music, I have never been more excited than I am now about the jazz scene, not just in the UK but internationally, because I think there is more diversity, there are more exciting approaches being taken by young musicians now than at any time in my memory. I mean, the paradox is that as the music itself becomes more exciting, the attempt to actually get an audience seems to be more and more difficult. My worst nightmare is we reach the day where there are more musicians than there are listeners out there. But it's a tremendously exciting scene at the moment.
Thank you. I'll come back to that last point, but Matt.
Yes. So is this coming through? Okay, that's better. Yeah, so my current job, which I'll start first of all, so I work for the Musicians Union. I'm the regional organiser for the north of England, so the MU is split into 6 regions. The north region is quite a large chunk, so our office is based over in Manchester, stretches from Chester and Grimsby, kind of in the kind of southernmost parts, through to the borders on both sides, so Carlisle, Newcastle obviously, and up to Berwick. So quite a wide range. So in terms of my work for the MU, we support the members specifically in terms of my role, my office, in terms of the North region. So that could range from everything from orchestral players through to theatre musicians, quite a few music teachers, and then musicians. The vast majority of our members are freelancers. They could be anything from jazz trumpeters through to indie guitarists through to drum and bass producers and DJs. So literally across the board. So in any given day, I could be dealing with any number of different kind of areas of law. For instance, we might be dealing with an employment law case one moment. In terms of our traditional trade union activity, so it could be like a disciplinary or a grievance or a redundancy issue. The next minute, you could be advising somebody on terms of a sync issue, or discussing elements to do with streaming or contracts with a record label or any number of other industry agreements. So it's very, very varied, and that makes it a very interesting job. But essentially our role, and we've been around for I think 123 years now, is to support and protect musicians. And again, in some respects, that's in terms of unscrupulous employers, people that might try and exploit musicians. At the other end of the spectrum, it's quite often protecting musicians from themselves, which is a big part of our job actually. But yes, it's hugely interesting and very entertaining at times as well. But yeah, we support musicians of all shapes, varieties and forms.
So how did you come to be doing this?
So I came, in terms of my history, I was one of the first students actually to study popular music at Salford University. At Salford University, right, yeah, so the popular music degree there, which I think was the first one in the UK. I think we were the second year to do it. So that was quite an early thing in terms of the kind of breadth of music education now, which has vastly transformed from that point in time. But prior to that, I was always interested in recording as well as being a musician. And back at that point, you had to choose either to be a studio engineer or a musician. I think the way technology moved on very rapidly as I was kind of in my late teenage years changed that enormously. So I started actually working in a jazz studio in South East London whilst I was at the sixth former. And then progressed, always working outside of education. And my background mainly in terms of my work after leaving university was I had run my own studio, so I worked as a programmer and producer. I played as a keyboard player and was involved in various bands, and particularly did an Irish folk band. Actually, we did quite a lot of stuff out in Germany, bizarrely enough. But I basically made my living as running a studio and as a musician in that kind of environment. So in that respect, I'm quite different from a lot of my counterparts in the MU. Those who've got musical backgrounds tend to be from either live performance areas. So whilst I've done that, my main focus was on recording.
At one stage, of course, you wouldn't have been allowed to be in the musicians union.
No, absolutely. Well, it's still a difficult area now sometimes. I think this is where the lines are very much blurred these days. So, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of these issues, but typically musicians now aren't just a musician who reads the dots and that's it, and I'm employed by somebody. So for some, say for instance, some of the musicians, some of our members at Northern Symphonia, that would still be the case. But for most of our members and most musicians now, they're doing lots and lots of different activities. So they're playing in a number of different outfits, they're teaching, they're writing, pitching for adverts, music for TV, etc. So there's a vast range of activities that comprise their daily activity and their income streams as well.
Thanks. I mean, obviously you've all got different backgrounds, although you kind of converge in the same set of problems, which I thought would be easy kind of think under three headings for me. You don't need to know what they are until we get there. But the first one is to do with funding. I mean, presumably, Chris, when you were at the Sage, the funding, you presumably got what you might say a degree of subsidy for folk works, whether from within the Sage or from the Arts Council or whatever.
Yes, obviously it was a national portfolio organisation. We were funded to be adventurous, to actually be able to lose money on folk gigs. Although actually quite a lot of the folk programme within the Sage actually made money, which was quite nice.
Yes,
but yes, I was part of, I had the luxury of being in a venue that did have money to subsidise acts that we wouldn't necessarily have been able to either bring to the UK or put on and hope to get an audience for.
And did that subsidy remain fairly constant during that period, or?
It kind of, yes, actually. Yes. I mean, obviously, Arts Council funding itself was cut during the heydays when we think back to the days of Culture 10 in the region and realise just how well off we were with that stream of money.
What period was that?
That was after Newcastle Gateshead was unsuccessful in getting Capital of Culture. Right. The local authorities at that time did the wonderful thing of still using the money that they'd allocated, that they had planned to allocate to culture, and spent it on culture.
Right.
And so we had several years of absolute fantastic funding with really quite interesting themes. There was a year called Look East, and we did a whole Chinese festival, and there were other things as well. And yeah, that looking back, that seems like a very blissful period.
Yes, you're probably better off than if they'd been Capital of Culture.
Could well have been, or certainly as good as.
Yeah. In terms of, now that you're the other side, as you said, an agent.
Yes.
So you presumably have X number of acts on your books. Are you aware when you're trying to find them gigs that you're dealing with people who are themselves struggling to get money to pay what you want?
Yes.
Doesn't it work like that?
Yeah. I mean, the whole scene nationally is of venues that are looking for tighter and tighter deals, basically.
Right.
And so that the economy of folk gigs, like probably many other gigs, will work on sort of mixtures of guarantees, box office splits, and calls. And so there's always that push to try and make the guarantees lower and lower, and hopefully make up on the door split.
So are you operating nationally, so to speak? I mean, would you be putting...
I'm trying to be, yes, that's right, yes. No, the artists that I represent.
So there are key venues from that perspective?
Yeah, yes. And, obviously there are venues that have got established folk audiences that are easier targets than others. But actually, going beyond, I mean, it's probably something you want to talk about afterwards, but sort of trying to encourage venues to go beyond what they call their folk audience and help develop the wider audience is a real key area that we need to be working on.
And how significant are festivals for?
Hugely, absolutely. I mean, I don't know what the festival statistics are now, but I know the Association of Festival Organisers some years ago carried out an economic impact survey into the economic benefits and impact of folk festivals to the UK economy, and it was something huge, like 77 million, and that was probably about 10 years ago. So festivals are an enormously important part of the music economy and the folk music economy for artists. Yeah,
I mean, as a newcomer to the North East, I've been very struck by how many folk festivals there are in remote parts of Northumberland.
Yes, and these are all quite small scales.
Yes, exactly.
They're around a village. They're not necessarily the big greenfield festival sites that make the news.
Right. I'll come back to the audience point in a minute.
Okay.
Paul, funding. How does that work for you?
Because of the adventurers, I mean, there are a few jazz promoters in the UK who do manage to survive without any funding assistance, but by and large they are putting on fairly safe, conservative sort of programs now. I don't want to knock that; that's their choice. But for us in Jazz North East, the very essence of jazz as an improvised music is that it develops And if you just go back to the past, you become part of the heritage industry, not actually part of a live artistic stream. So we could not survive without some forms of external funding. Indeed, a couple of years ago, we very nearly folded because basically we were on the point of bankruptcy. We got through that by having a crowdfunding appeal, pardon me, which I'm pleased to say attracted donations from as far afield as Australia, Canada, throughout Europe and so on. And we put on a fundraising concert, which originally was just going to be in one venue in the evening, but so many musicians volunteered their services, we actually ran it as an all-day event in 2 venues simultaneously. Now, that's incredibly gratifying that there is that level of support, but you can't go on like that, So we are dependent on public funding. We used to get some local authority funding. Of course, the pressure on local authorities now is such that has almost completely dried up. We do get some money from the PRS Foundation. Particularly the last couple of years, we've had funding from them for another strand in our programming, Women Make Music, which concentrates very much on the contribution of women artists to jazz and improvised music. But our main source of funding is the Arts Council and the grants for the arts programme. I don't want to appear to be, biting the hand that feeds us, but if I have a criticism of the Arts Council, is that decisions seem to be made without any feeling for context whatsoever. Assessments of applications are made at a central place in Manchester and scored. They then come back to the regional office for actual allocation of funds. But nobody seems to say, hang on, this application might have a few flaws in it, but if we stop funding this organisation, what will happen to the provision of jazz in the North East? So there is not that contextualisation. Nonetheless, without them we wouldn't survive, so I have to be grateful.
Just thinking historically, presumably, I'm ignorant here, but I thought at one point there were clearly regional arts boards.
There is still a regional office of the Arts Council, but they do not make the initial assessment of applications now. Basically, they get back each month all the applications relating to the region with the scorings from Manchester,
right.
And they are strongly influenced by that scoring. That also tends to militate against smaller organisations which might not have dedicated people who are, almost specialists in funding applications.
I was just thinking that the Arts Council seems to create inconsistencies within itself because of this system of not taking a regional view. There's an organisation in Newcastle called Waka Waka Africa who are doing amazing things in supporting Black and African music. Yet they recently had quite a funding cut or an application turned down. Yet at the same time, the Arts Council are really pushing their creative case for diversity, and nobody else in Newcastle was doing that. So it just seemed an absolutely ludicrous decision. And I think that's just a little microcosm of what happens because of this sort of regional, a national look and not taking into account regional variations.
The other question I was going to ask both of you two as promoters, has there been a time in your promoting experience where there was significant money coming in from record companies to help support particular acts? Which would be the case in rock music, or has folk and jazz always operated without that sort of money?
I guess there is kind of occasionally some supporting kind. A record company that wants to push a particular act. We don't receive any direct funding from record companies. But there may be a level of subsidy in the fee that we're being asked because the record company itself will pick up. It doesn't happen very often. It's not of major significance. No. Just to touch very briefly on a similar area, we do indirectly get a certain amount of international funding as well from bands coming in, particularly from Europe, who may get a contribution from their own national arts organisations and so on, which makes them affordable for us.
So we're getting there, yes. That's like the Edinburgh International Festival, yeah. And that would be the same in folk.
Yeah, I mean, so many record companies in the folk music world are at such a small scale, and so many people are producing their own albums and funding them themselves, that there isn't that kind of huge industry behind, the mechanism behind it as there is for popular, more popular music. There are some key folk music record labels, such as Fellside, which also does jazz, which will support their own artists. And, you'll take out joint adverts and stuff, or Topic, who are very much at the forefront of things. But yeah, it's not megabucks, certainly.
Right.
It might be a shared advert in F Roots or something like that, or a little bit towards tour promotion, but we're not talking a lot of money. And artists that have been taken on by bigger labels, I think Eliza Carthy earlier in her career, which she was with Warner Brothers, really struggled to fulfill what they wanted, the image that they wanted her to be. So it's not necessarily always the best thing for the artist.
Yeah. Matt, do you get involved in your MU role with funding issues, or with state organisations? Or
I think increasingly so, yeah. If you talk to a lot of musicians, they won't necessarily be aware that they're working in a venue that's had public funding. They're kind of almost blissfully unaware, I think. And it's not really, as far as the musician's concerned, it's often about making sure that they get paid, so it doesn't really matter where that money has originated from. However, I think particularly we're kind of referencing kind of the popular music scene to kind of rock, etc. Things have shifted enormously in the past 4 or 5 years. Particularly, I think, a lot of focus has been on momentum funding that's been administered by the PRS, which is basically Arts Council money. So it's government money, which is now being channeled into developing artists at a certain stage of their career. But we're increasingly having conversations with members about how do I get funding. The problem with a lot of musicians is they don't necessarily see themselves as a business, and that's something that's kind of certainly we kind of run workshops on from time to time. Of actually, how do you get your hands on funding? And the typical thing musicians want is money for recording, actually. It's one of the hardest things to get. In actual fact, one of the things we've certainly been encouraging musicians to do is to apply for things like grants for the arts, particularly in terms of live support, because actually that is an area in which they can help as long as you've got a well put together proposal. And it's also that idea of also seeing, rather than a musician just going, I want somebody to support my career, in the mould of a record label just going, okay, sign on the dotted line, here's the next album, here's the next cycle, and you carry on from that point. Actually, a lot of funding actually focuses on specific events. So it's putting on an event or a tour, or it's around there's a time frame to it. And increasingly, I think the musicians that are taking advantage of funding are realising that there's these specific markers and events, rather than just an overall, somebody needs to fund my career. It's looking at individual tours, events, releases, etc., and kind of looking for funding for those individual things, and then moving on to the next thing, the next project, whatever it might be. But yeah, it's changed massively, and that's an indicator of the changes to the recording industry. In terms of, there was so much money swishing around 15, 20 years ago that supported lots of fledgling artists, much as we might have maligned the major artists and the money that they earned and, how ridiculous it was. Actually, that money did filter down to the smaller labels, and it did help support some of the independent labels. And it funded music that wasn't actually otherwise viable, is the truth of the matter. And culturally, that was really, really important, and we're now really missing that. And that's, in a small way, the momentum funding is an indicator of how much that is. It's a really seismic shift, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we could have another discussion about why all that money now goes to and why it doesn't come back into music.
Yes, yeah.
Apple and so on. Yeah. It's interesting that the Scottish Arts Council did fund recording. And in fact, I think, Matt, did you get money for your record? Yeah. From the Scottish Arts Council? Right. Brilliant. Yeah, so that was always something that was significant. Yeah. That I don't think the English Arts Council ever really got into, at least not for popular music. One other aspect of this, it was interesting when you were talking about your strands, and therefore you could get money from the PRS Foundation for Women Play Jazz. I get the sense that sort of strand funding is something people have to be opportunistically aware of. I was at a conference on progressive rock last week, and one of the things I hadn't really realised was that how dependent some of those early bands of the more surprising sort that operated on the kind of fringes of avant-garde, classical, jazz, rock, were on the Contemporary Music Network. It was funded by the Arts Council, and for many years, you know, jazz musicians, even certain sorts of folk musicians could all get, and I guess that just went, and there's no equivalent now.
Yeah. I mean, there's the strategic touring scheme that the Arts Council still run, but it's actually really hard to get any money. In the old days, when Folkworks was doing national touring, we were very lucky, and the Arts Council actually encouraged Folkworks in the first instance to take up national touring, because nobody at that time was touring folk music into arts centre venues, and so in that way Folkworks was able to do groundbreaking work there. And so we were able to regularly access touring funding, and right up till 10, 12 years ago that was still the case. Certainly when we went to the Sage, the Arts Council felt they were giving Sage Gateshead so much money for everything anyway that they weren't going to give us any additional for touring. But when the new Strategic Touring Fund sort of started again about 4 or 5 years ago, we tried to get an application in there, but it's just incredibly difficult to get money out of them now.
Right.
And I'm not sure how much that is available to individual artists. Whether you need to actually be an organisation to.
And of course, the problem is, as already been mentioned, it means you then have to have a skill at grant writing, which is not necessarily what anybody has or wants.
That's certainly a definitive set of skills to actually do that.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing as well, Tim, I think we touched on Paul before, is like the change in terms of local authority funding as well. I think in terms of the Arts Council, it's kind of fairly well documented, the London-centric allocation of funds. But also what's kind of perhaps lesser known is the amount that actually goes to music. And if you talk to people at the Arts Council, which we do occasionally, it's actually not specific. I don't think it's necessarily for the want of trying, but actually other areas of the arts, so dance, theatre, are much better. They have much more of an inbuilt culture of getting funding from an artistic perspective than musicians do. It's just something that's only now starting to creep in. And I think hopefully over a period of time musicians will start to become more aware, and it might be something that we can, for instance, and other organisations can play a role in educating to help people in that regard.
I mean, I suspect historically that's because that's the only way they could get funding.
Yes.
Whereas musicians had other models.
Exactly, whereas that is now changed.
Yeah. If I can move on, the final couple of things I want to ask before we open it to the floor. The first is audience building, which Paul's touched on. As somebody who goes fairly regularly to both jazz and folk gigs, I am aware that I'm probably in the average age range of the audience, particularly at jazz gigs. I might even be at the younger age at jazz gigs. So I went to a very good concert at the Sage a couple of weeks ago with a drummer whose name I can't remember, from
Thomas
Norway. Yeah, which was really good, really interesting and adventurous sort of music. And I was there were very few young people there, even though in a different context. If there'd been other sort of gig, I could imagine a lot more young people there. Folk is a bit different because there's much more obvious. There seems to have been more. Well, certainly in sort of traditional music terms, things like facies in Scotland and those sort of educational things get a better sense of kind of young people. But even at sort of standard commercial folk gigs, you kind of get a feeling of ageing audience. I mean, how do you two see that problem as being addressed or not addressed, or is it addressable?
Well, funny enough, I mean, I mentioned we had a gig on Tuesday here in Newcastle, and I did actually mention to somebody that I would be coming here and talking about improvised music and its audience, to which the response was, well, that'll be easy, just say there isn't one and sit down. I'm not as pessimistic as that. You're quite right, audiences for jazz concerts are sadly small, and I'm sad about that. Not from the point of view of my organisation, but for the musicians, and indeed for the people who aren't there, who I think would enjoy it if they were there. But I'm not pessimistic. Our audiences they're not growing at the moment, but I think they are holding up. And there is a slow but perceptible shift in the demographic of the audience. I mean, that gig on Tuesday, I think probably in terms of the number of young people there and the ethnic diversity in that audience, It was much, much better than it would have been 5 years ago, possibly even just a year ago. Having said that, the total audience consisted of 22 people, so it's perhaps not a particularly valid sample. But I think the adventurousness of our programme hopefully eventually will get over to people who are looking for something a bit different, looking for something that pushes the envelope a bit. You lose some people along the way. Some of the older members of our audience we don't see anymore. But even as an old white middle-class man myself, I accept that we can't tailor our programme to suit yesterday's audience. It's tomorrow's audience we're interested in. And as I say, I'm optimistic. We're never going to have mass popularity, but I think we can sustain and build and improve the demographic of the audience.
I mean, I would say one of the paradoxes is that I don't think there's been such an exciting time for young jazz musicians ever.
Oh, absolutely right. Yeah.
Which means that the people wanting to play it, well, that was clear in that gig I went to, are actually young.
Yeah. Mind if they went to each other's gigs, that would help.
Yeah, exactly. But musicians don't do that.
No, I know.
Very, very similar situation in the folk music scene. There are some fantastic young acts that are out there, and you can see the future of music is safe in terms of the people performing it. But very much that we see the audience are there supporting it, but they're very much at the grey-haired end. We did some research on audience demographics at Sage about a year ago, and actually discovered our folk music was marginally older than even our classical music and our jazz audience. So I was quite surprised, given our association with the Newcastle University folk degree and our access to young people. It's still really hard to actually get people coming to gigs, and it's probably to do with context of venue, and whether it's not necessarily just the music that is put on that actually brings people out. It's where it's happened, it's perhaps who is actually organising it and how that is communicated that is really important to the to building the audience as well. The one place where folk music audiences are really, really healthy in terms of young people is the festival going audience. That is absolutely apparent, that there are masses of young people getting a lot of music at festivals, and it's participation as well as actually seeing performances, but that doesn't necessarily translate to week by week audiences in more standard venues, and that's maybe just because what we're providing in those venues isn't the right context and atmosphere.
I mean, the other aspect of this is how you actually kind of let people know about the music. And I mean, is there any significant, I don't know what you would call them, kind of mediators in the North East in terms of newspapers or magazines or radio programmes or all the things that people used to use to promote?
None of the newspapers in the North East now, I think apart from one in Darlington, runs a regular jazz column at all. There used to be a few, but as the journalists responsible have retired, they've not been replaced. The local listings magazines, we advertise in them, but the amount of editorial support that we get is very variable. So, no, it's an uphill struggle, and it's not just in the North East. I think jazz does find it very, very difficult to get significant media coverage anywhere in the UK. I would just like, though, to mention one other thing from the jazz point of view. One of the strategies that we're adopting, and strategy makes it sound a bit cold-blooded. I mean, we're enthusiastic about this. Just as young musicians now have a very, very diverse range of interests, and that's one of the things that makes the current jazz scene so stimulating, is there's so many different strands being pulled into it. But equally, we are trying to work with promoters and organisers in other genres, other areas. This year we will be jointly programming a concert with the local Asian arts organisation, Gem Arts, at their their South Asian festival, we, for the first time, are actually programming a jazz stage at the NARC Festival, which some people here will probably know is the kind of music arm of the Ousburn Festival here in Newcastle. So we are putting on 4 bands, which interestingly enough really reflect the diversity of our programme. There's a relatively straight ahead band. There's a vocalist working solo with electronics. There is what you might call, I suppose, if they want to be categorised and they hate me for it, an adventurous jazz rock trio. And there's an out-and-out full-blooded improv set. So, but it's still a jazz stage. Ideally, what we'd like to be doing is to actually feeding acts into broader programmes. We haven't yet succeeded in that, but we're working away at it.
Any media that you use at all?
No, I mean, there's the standard folk press doesn't necessarily have much footage in this area. It's the magazine F Roots and to some extent the World Music magazine Songlines. Musician Jez Lowe still has a column in the Northern Echo, but other than that, Alan Nicol is a great supporter in the Chronicle, but other than that, there are not a huge number of people doing it. We used to have a dedicated folk radio show on Radio Newcastle, but that was killed off about 8 years ago. Alistair Anderson used to do that, and it was a really useful source of local listings. So it's difficult. It's just trying to get your head above the everything else that's wonderful that's happening.
Yeah. Any comments from your perspective?
Yeah, I think
on publicity and things.
Well, just going back to the kind of the idea of the grey audience, I think actually when we look at the number of heritage rock acts, it's not something that's like completely.
That's true. Actually, the Yes audience is probably the same age.
Exactly. It's not confined just to jazz and folk. I think it's an issue generally that audiences. It's how do you retain an audience, particularly with a younger generation that's got so much else vying for its attention. So it's not, music isn't, it used to be such a big feature in terms of youth culture. It's now got so many other aspects in terms of gamers, for instance, like vying for not just people's attention but also crucially their finances. There's also there's other aspects to this as well. Without being too contentious. We could potentially look at the kind of the concept of the gig, particularly based around being in a room with alcohol. There's actually a new generation has a different view of perhaps how those should work. So we've seen over the last few years the rise in house gigs, for instance. There's like an organisation now that actually specialises in setting up gigs in people's houses in cities across the world, actually. And interestingly, they've got little kind of, the particular one I'm thinking of, they've got things like they have little rules about you can't text, you can't take photos, you can't video, you can't talk when people are playing. It's very much a different kind of
gig.
Well, yeah, exactly. But it's actually they're actually doing some of these kind of things outside of the normal gig circuit. So, and actually you might have like 30 or 40 people in a large house. It's the same kind of audience you might have for a jazz gig, but it's because it's not in a conventional venue, you don't necessarily know about it. So there's things like that happening, and perhaps people, but I think we're seeing patterns of consumption changing drastically, most obviously in recorded music, but actually in live music that may well start to, in fact it is happening already as well. People are looking at gigs in different types of venues. I think it's all interesting, the comments about perhaps cross-fertilisation as well, because the younger generation doesn't have such rigid views of what a genre is. Simply because if you look at any teenager up to kind of 25-year-old, they've really grown up on perusing music on YouTube. That's their kind of the place they go to listen to music. Now, there's no kind of divisions within YouTube, or even lots of streaming services, unless you want there to be, on what a genre should be. And even the fact like suggestions on streaming service might link an artist not necessarily according to genre. It might be due to voice tone or complexities or other aspects of the music that aren't necessarily what you might categorise as a genre, which a lot of which is developed actually by music journalists originally, and also in terms of filing systems in record stores. So all those kind of things have changed, and musicians and fans are actually interested in merging those kind of things. I think there's also an interesting thing we might see with some of these, as we have got growing aging audiences that are effectively subsidised by public money in terms of funding. I think we'll start to see more of across, the kind of demands being placed on some of those organisations to actually mingle with different styles of music, and actually commercially that makes sense, but it also enlarges both audiences potentially. I mean, we've come across certainly some of the kind of contracts we've dealt with in the last few months. There's a massive wave off the back of the Heritage Orchestra at the Proms last year of dance acts, like Pete Tong, for instance, going out with an orchestra. Cream in Liverpool are now doing it with the Liverpool Phil, and there's Peter Hook with New Order from New Order is doing a similar thing. So there's these kind of like, particularly as actually a dance music audience is now at the age where, my kind of age, where they're actually got money to spend, some people, and they're kind of looking at actually different ways of reinventing that music and actually merging different influences together.
And speaking historically, of course, Irish folk music is supposed to have started in big houses, people gathering together.
Yes. Yeah.
And certainly in the 50s, I was fairly amazed to discover when we were doing our research, most significant clubs didn't have alcoholic licenses, whether they were jazz clubs or blues clubs or whatever. So in some ways, I think what we're seeing is another aspect of the end of record company domination on how live music works. And there are probably going to be positive aspects as well as negative ones in terms of genre. Anyway, if anybody got questions from the floor, we've still got about 10 minutes or so.
I've played lots of different genres of music, and I think 22 is probably about the average audience we've had at a lot of those gigs. Like, it's really difficult, but with the whole sort of clean and safe cities thing, like, no one's allowed to stick posters anymore. When I first moved here, I saw posters around the place that had been there since the 60s, and then posters were piled on top of them, like the kind of signs of life that are going on here, and now you're pretty much treated like it's wall-mounted litter almost. And so promoters are kind of, I don't know, I've yet to encounter one that really puts a lot more effort in than making a Facebook page and then relying on that. We recently did a gig for someone that was a band that had been going 25 years, big festival band, and maybe 50 people had been invited on a Facebook page, and that was about it. So we've got that issue that there's no way of making, apart from in the back, so the takeaways around Newcastle, you can't stick posters anywhere. Obviously venues have been closing and ones are not opening to take their places, or the ones that have failed quite quickly because it's difficult to let people know about it for the reasons I'm saying. There's one interesting move though, which is people starting to go back to the social clubs, which are also a kind of, they've got a limited lifespan perhaps. The type of people that have been going there for a long time are getting older, and they're concerned that maybe their establishments are not going to last that much longer. So certainly like noise bands and some Northern Soul events have recently been going to them and establishing connections where the clubs are taking on things they maybe wouldn't have considered before, and the young people who are going to those events are going to these venues that they've kind of perhaps written off. So there are sort of possibilities there, but I think one of the biggest problems is the fact that you can't publicise it like physically, materially to people. They like to keep the streets clean for the shoppers and all that kind of thing. And flyering, again, another thing that it's quite strict. So I think there are sort of bigger currents affecting the reasons that it's struggling to get audiences out in Newcastle. That's my comment.
Yep.
Thanks very much. Just a question for, I suppose for all the panellists. It's about, there's been a few mentions of international work, so liaising with people overseas, artists coming in from overseas, and I'm interested whether or not you see a trajectory for that, particularly obviously in folk, but also in jazz as well, and from a union perspective. Is that something that, can somebody be a professional folk musician and exist only in a domestic space, a national space, or is that something that's been increasing over the years or decreasing? Or
Most folk musicians that are even very, very well respected folk musicians often still have a day job. So there is a mixed economy of how they make their money. It might be teaching, or it might be something that isn't necessarily related. Internationally, there are some quite strong markets in Germany and some parts of Europe for traditional British folk music, and increasingly there are the festivals in Australia and Canada and places that are really interested in taking musicians out there, but I'm not sure yet how much export support our government gives to musicians. I know that certainly, that's been referred to before, that other European countries are quite happy to support their musicians coming to us. And Canada, the Canada Council for the Arts, is a particularly strong one for sort of making sure that Canadian artists get to Europe. So I'm not sure how much we're doing reciprocally.
But the British Council used to do it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Tommy Smith said British Council.
They tend to send musicians on specific projects rather than just.
Well, sometimes on specific tours to sell British jazz or whatever.
Usually in kind of war-torn regions. Yes.
Yes, there's as much politics as there is culture, I think, in decisions made by the British Council. In terms of jazz and sort of international links and so on, again, as Chris says, I mean, the vast majority of jazz musicians have to actually do teaching or some other job in order to make a living. The number of UK jazz musicians who are living entirely from performing is probably very, very small. In terms of international links, I think they're important, perhaps not so much in terms of enabling people to sustain a living, but just in terms of innovation and cross-fertilisation and so on. I mean, certainly many of the most adventurous and interesting young UK musicians are now increasingly collaborating with overseas musicians, particularly in Europe, but sometimes further in afield. We've also had musicians come from Canada with the assistance of funding from the Canadian authorities and so on. I mentioned our Paris Sur Time project, where we brought over some musicians from Paris, and some of those had previously worked with musicians here in Newcastle. So we are very much involved in trying to develop those links, but for creative more than commercial reasons.
I think on one hand, there's the kind of, you've got a wider audience, particularly in terms of, I mentioned YouTube before. You go on YouTube, you can see where people, which country, which demographic is actually viewing your videos. It actually opens up a world of possibilities potentially for even independent artists to go, actually, who would have known it? We've got a massive audience in Italy or in Uruguay. And actually, if you start to foster those relationships, it could be that you could organise a tour, you could connect with people over there. So there's those possibilities. But the brutal reality commercially is it's very, very hard to go abroad. I mean, particularly in terms of certain countries, like, for instance, the States at the moment, the visa requirements are just unbelievable. So one of my colleagues, Kelly, at the back, is actually involved in a visa task force that the MU is part of, in looking at that whole issue. But, it's so expensive. So without record company support, which is harder than ever to get, it's very, very difficult to do that in reality. I mean, most artists, the biggest challenge is actually touring in this country. That's the reality of it, I think. I just wanted to go back at one of the comments the gentleman made before as well about kind of changing in venues. I think there's, again, this is not necessarily a place for the whole discussion on this, but there's an interesting change around city centres, the kind of almost gentrification of city centres. You mentioned, not being able to put up flyer anymore, not being able to put up posters, etc. And I think also the venues, but stuff like the kind of, there's been almost a cleaning up of the city centres, the kind of boozing culture that has, particularly in some cities, been really clamped down on in terms by the police. There's just some justification for that, obviously, but that has affected venues who primarily would get their money from drink sales. You've also got things like supermarket drink sales that have fed into that. So there's a different kind of culture emerging, which is making people look elsewhere. And there's big threats to the venues, and that's another thing we've been involved in terms of agent of change principle and trying to work with venues a bit more collaboratively to campaign and actually make it clear that some venues that have been there for years are affected by, flats being built next door, for instance. And we've been involved in a number of cases like that as well.
One aspect of the ecology, which is what we're really talking about, which is interesting, is actually the role of universities. Because certainly, I know in Scotland, universities were very significant as the source of both first jazz clubs and the first folk clubs. I would guess in Newcastle, at one time, the university was very significant for jazz in the 50s and the early kind of blues clubs. And students and student unions became absolutely crucial venues in the early days of rock. And it certainly seems to me, not being a student anymore, there has been a move. There was a move in the 90s particularly to sort of dancing discos away from live music, and less of that sense of kind of students itself as both an audience and a venue and a source of musicians being experimental, which was in a sense state subsidised.
It's also symptomatic of that whole commercialisation of the students' experience. You know, students are now really customers.
Yeah.
That's also extended to the whole student union things. I mean, we sometimes do student fairs, and in most cases we don't actually do them because they cost thousands of pounds just to go and have a table up at a freshers' fair, for instance. But that's the extent, you know, the student gig circuit doesn't exist like it did 15, 20 years ago for any kind of music, really.
Yes, I have to be eternally grateful that the Students' Union in Bangor, where I was an undergraduate, actually booked Joy Division.
Wouldn't happen now.
No. But yes, I mean, that's definitely a real demise.
Yeah. Any other points from the floor? So just to finish off, I get the sense that despite all the negatives we've been talking about, everybody here is really optimistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced that the future of jazz and improvised music is safe, because it's actually in the hands of musicians who are so dedicated that they are driven people, and they are going to continue to make exciting music. I just hope it would be lovely if a few more people actually came along and experienced the excitement that they're generating.
And exactly the same for folk music as well. There are some fantastic and really exciting performers out there who are taking real traditional music but doing different things with it, and really taking it forward, but believing in where it came from. And it's a very exciting time still for folk music.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging time. Lots of things are changing. In terms of the kind of main commercial music industry, we've had a period of stability in terms of copyright law and very much established norms that are now being kind of turned on their head. That's having a massive impact. But I think actually, I mentioned the way people consume music. Music is kind of ubiquitous now, whereas it used to be only on your record player or on a jukebox. It's now on your headphones. It's playing on the bus. It's in every shop that you go in. It's, you can hear somebody else's music down the street. It's everywhere. In terms of recording music, I think there's lots of issues around that, but some of which are very positive. But I think actually the kind of, you mentioned it before, but the joy of a live performance, and people are going to crave that real experience that's outside of a screen or a phone, something that's actually real, that can be part of the sense of community of being at a great, fantastic gig. Perhaps not for everybody, but that's certainly a real positive that I think it's almost going full circle. So,
thanks, and from our academic perspective, this is a wonderful example of what we meant by an enthusiast promoters. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.